My name is James Murphy. I want to start there because I've been saying it to myself a lot over the past few days, just to make sure I still know it. Just to make sure I'm still the same person who got in his car on a Tuesday morning and started driving west with a full tank of gas and a bag of pretzels on the passenger seat, and absolutely no reason to think that any of this was coming. My name is James Murphy. I'm 34 years old. I have an apartment in St. Paul. I have a cat named Gerald, who probably thinks I'm dead by now. I have a sister who texts me every Sunday and will notice by this weekend that I haven't responded. I keep telling myself those things. I write them down between his visits. It helps a little. This is the part I keep coming back to, the part that bothers me most when I think about it now. There was nothing wrong that morning. The car was fine. The weather was clear. I had just filled up at a gas station outside Billings and gotten back on the highway heading west toward Missoula, and everything was completely, unremarkably normal. The radio was playing something I didn't recognize. The fields on either side of the road were flat and pale brown, the kind of landscape that looks the same for 100 miles in every direction. I'd been driving for about 40 minutes when I felt the first thing. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a sensation. Something underneath me, deep in the car, a kind of shuddering that lasted maybe 2 seconds and then stopped. I turned the radio down and drove for another minute, and nothing happened, so I turned it back up. Then it happened again. Longer this time. A vibration through the seat and the steering wheel and the floor under my feet all at once, like the car was trying to tell me something, and I wasn't listening. I looked at the dash. No warning lights. Temperature was normal. I pulled my foot off the gas and the car slowed naturally, which was fine. But when I pressed the gas again, there was nothing there. The engine was running. I could hear it. But the car wasn't moving anymore. It was just rolling, slower and slower, until I pulled onto the gravel shoulder and stopped. I sat there for a minute with the engine running and tried the gas again. Nothing. I put it in park and turned the key. It started up fine. I put it back in drive. Nothing. The moment I gave it gas, the transmission just sat there like a door that wouldn't open no matter how many times you tried the handle. I turned the car off. Outside, it was getting dark. Not fully dark yet, but the kind of early evening dark where the light is still there but it's going fast, and you can tell that within another 20 minutes, you won't be able to see more than a few feet in front of you. I got out and stood on the shoulder and looked up and down the highway. There were no other cars, no buildings visible from where I was standing, no street lights, no signs that I could read from that distance. Nothing. I took out my phone and looked at the screen. No signal. I tried anyway. Called AAA first, then my sister, then just 911. The phone would try and fail in that same quiet way phones do when there's just nothing out there to connect to. I stood on the roof of my car for about 5 minutes holding the phone over my head and moving it in slow circles, and got 1 bar for about 4 seconds, not long enough to connect to anything, and then it was gone. I got back in the car. The temperature outside was fine, mild even, but it would drop once the sun was fully down and I had a light jacket and nothing else. I had about half a bottle of water and the rest of the pretzels. I looked at those things and did a very quick and quiet calculation in my head about how long I wanted to sit in the car on the side of a highway in Montana where no one knew I was, and the answer was not very long. I looked out across the fields. I almost missed it. I was looking down the road, not into the fields, and I only caught it because it was moving. A faint yellow light far off the highway that disappeared for a second and then came back. I watched it for a while. It was steady once I found it again. A window, I figured, or a porch light, maybe a mile away, maybe two, set back from the road in a way that made it almost invisible against the flat, dark landscape. I thought about staying with the car. I thought about it for a while. Then I grabbed my jacket and my phone and my water, and I started walking toward that light. The field wasn't fenced off from the road, which I was grateful for. The ground was hard and flat and dry, and once I got off the shoulder, the gravel turned to short, tough grass that crunched quietly under my boots. It was darker than I expected out there, away from even the faint ambient light of the road. I couldn't see much more than a few feet in front of me. I kept my eyes on the light in the distance and walked toward it and tried not to think about twisting an ankle in the dark. It took about 20 minutes to reach the house, longer than I expected. It was an old farmhouse, 2 stories, white paint that had gone gray in patches, a covered porch running across the front, a single light above the porch door. There was a truck parked in the dirt to one side of the house, old but solid looking, and a barn maybe 50 yards behind it that was completely dark. The yard was clean and kept. There were 2 rocking chairs on the porch, neither of them moving. I stood at the edge of the yard for a moment. The house looked the way old farmhouses always look, familiar in a way that's hard to explain, like a photograph of a place you've never actually been. There was a welcome mat at the base of the porch steps. There was a wind chime hanging from the corner of the porch, though there was no wind and it wasn't moving. I walked up the porch steps and knocked. The man who opened the door was probably in his late 60s or early 70s. He was shorter than me, broad through the shoulders, with white hair and a face that was deeply lined in the way that comes from decades of being outside. He was wearing a red flannel shirt with small, round snap buttons down the front, and he looked at me with the calm, unhurried expression of someone who was not at all surprised to find a stranger on his porch in the dark. Car trouble. He said it like a statement, not a question, like this was a thing that happened often enough that he didn't need to ask. I told him yes, transmission, I thought, and that I had no signal and needed to use a phone if he had one. Sure thing. Come on in. I'm Henry. He put his hand out and I shook it. His handshake was warm and dry and firm the way older men's handshakes tend to be when they've spent their lives working with their hands. I followed him inside. The house was warm, warmer than outside by quite a bit, and it smelled like something was cooking, something that immediately made my stomach contract in a way I couldn't ignore. Roasting meat, garlic, something herbed, thyme maybe, or rosemary. The kind of smell that fills a whole house and makes it feel lived in and safe. The front hallway opened into a living room on the left, a staircase going up on the right. The living room had a couch, an armchair, a low wooden coffee table, a television that looked like it hadn't been turned on in years, books on a shelf, a framed photograph on the wall that I didn't look at closely. Everything was clean and old and quiet. Henry led me back toward the kitchen, which was at the rear of the house, and that's where the smell was coming from. There was a large stove against one wall with the oven on, and through the small window in the oven door, I could see the dark interior and the faint glowing of the heating element. A cast iron pot sat on one of the burners with a lid on it. The kitchen table was a big rectangle of old wood with 4 chairs around it. One place was already set. Henry gestured to one of the other chairs. I told him I really just needed to use the phone, and then I'd get out of his way. When did you last eat? I told him lunch, around 1. It was past 8 by then. He nodded like I'd confirmed something he already knew. I got a roast in the oven, more than enough for 2. I should have said no to the food. I know that now, and I think some part of me knew it then, though I couldn't have explained why. There was no reason not to stay. The man seemed kind. The house was warm. The food smelled extraordinary. I was hungry in the bone-deep way you get when you've been stressed and outside and moving and it's been too many hours since you ate. There was no logical reason to say no and walk back out to wait in the cold. So I sat down. He moved around the kitchen without hurrying, pulling things from the refrigerator and the counter, setting a second place at the table. He brought out a loaf of bread that he cut with a long, serrated knife and put on a board between us. He poured water into a glass and set it by my plate. He did all of it quietly, without asking me questions or making me feel like I needed to fill the silence, and something about that made me relax a little more than I had when I walked in. When the food came, it was exactly what it had smelled like. A beef roast, slow cooked, with vegetables that had absorbed all the juice and fat from the meat. He spooned it out onto my plate, and then his own, and we ate. The meat was perfect. I remember thinking that. Tender and heavily seasoned, the kind of food that takes hours to prepare and tastes like someone who knows what they're doing made it. I ate more than I meant to. Henry talked during dinner. He didn't ask me much about myself, which in retrospect is something I should have found strange, though at the time it just felt like courtesy. He talked about the farm, about growing up here as a child when his parents ran cattle, about the years after his wife died when he'd let some of the land go and kept mostly to himself. He had a daughter in Denver who didn't call much anymore. He said it plainly, without bitterness, as a simple fact. I remember thinking it must be very quiet out here, very still. I asked a few small questions. I finished my food. He cleared the plates. Then he got the phone. It was on the kitchen wall, a rotary model in cream-colored plastic, the handset hanging from a coiled cord. He lifted the handset and handed it to me, and I put it to my ear. There was no dial tone. I held it there for a moment, waiting. Henry looked at it the same way I did, with what appeared to be mild confusion. He tried it himself, listened, then shook his head slowly. Lines must be down. Happens sometimes out here. Storm will knock them out, and it can take a day or 2. I asked if there was another option. He said the only other phone was in the barn, and it ran off the same line. He thought for a moment and said the lines were usually back up by morning. He said the couch was comfortable if I wanted to stay the night. I stood in his kitchen and thought about walking back out to the road. I'd come in from the field in the dark, and I'd barely been able to see 2 feet in front of me. The road was a long walk back, unlit, with nothing waiting for me at the end of it, except a car that didn't run. The temperature would keep dropping. And in the morning, the phone lines would probably be back up and I could call for help. It was a reasonable decision. It was the decision any reasonable person would make. Henry set me up on the couch with a blanket and a pillow and showed me where the bathroom was down the hall past the staircase, second door on the left. He said goodnight in a quiet, unhurried way and went upstairs, and I heard his bedroom door close. I lay on the couch in the dark and listened to the house settle. It was quiet out there in a way that city quiet isn't. No traffic, no voices, no hum of anything electronic beyond the faint tick of a clock somewhere in the other room. The house made small sounds, wood contracting in the cooling night, something moving on the roof that I told myself was wind. Outside the window, nothing. I wasn't comfortable exactly. There was something about the house, about the stillness of it, that I couldn't put a name to. Not a smell or a sound, just a quality to the air, the way certain rooms feel when you walk into them, and something in you goes quiet and watchful without knowing why. I closed my eyes and told myself I was tired and overthinking, and that the phone would work in the morning. I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark for a long time, listening, and eventually I stopped trying to sleep and just lay still, staring up at the ceiling of a stranger's living room, waiting for morning. I don't know what time it was when I finally got up. Late. Past midnight, probably. The clock in the other room had been ticking steadily since I lay down, and at some point I'd stopped hearing it, the way you stop hearing anything that repeats long enough. But when I sat up and looked toward the window, the darkness outside was the deep, total kind that only happens in the middle of the night in places with no ambient light for miles in any direction. Not the dark of early evening, the dark of the hours that most people sleep through without ever knowing they exist. My mouth was dry. I'd drunk all the water Henry had given me at dinner, and I hadn't thought to refill it before lying down. And now I was thirsty enough that it had become the thing keeping me awake. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I folded the blanket back and stood up slowly. The living room was dark except for a faint gray light coming through the window. Some combination of moon and open sky that was just enough to see shapes. The couch, the coffee table, the outline of the armchair. I stood still for a moment and listened to the house. Nothing. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that you can feel against your eardrums. I moved toward the hallway. Henry had shown me where the bathroom was before he went to bed. Down the hall, past the staircase, second door on the left. I'd been to it once earlier in the evening, and I remembered the layout well enough that I didn't need a light. I walked slowly, keeping one hand near the wall, letting my eyes adjust. The hallway was narrow. The staircase was on my right as I passed it, the banister a darker shape against the wall. Ahead of me, the hall continued back toward the rear of the house, past a series of closed doors. I counted them as I passed. First door on the left, closed. A door across from it on the right, also closed. Then the bathroom, second on the left, the door slightly ajar, a faint smell of soap coming from inside. I went in, ran the tap quietly, drank water from my cupped hands until the thirst was gone. I straightened up and looked at myself in the mirror above the sink. I looked the way I felt. Tired, a little pale, the kind of hollow-eyed that comes from lying awake in a strange place for too many hours. My reflection looked back at me from the dark mirror, and I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. And then I turned off the tap and opened the bathroom door and stepped back into the hallway. The door across from the bathroom was open. I was certain it had been closed when I walked past it a minute earlier. Not almost certain. Certain. I had noticed it, registered it as closed along with all the others, the way you passively register details in an unfamiliar space at night. Closed. And now it was open, standing about a third of the way into the hallway, and the gap between the door and the frame was completely dark. I stood there in the hallway and looked at it. I told myself it had been open before, and I'd simply misremembered. I told myself old doors in old houses drift open on their own, that the latch hadn't caught properly, and some settling of the floorboards or a shift in air pressure had moved it. Both of those things are true of old houses, and both of them are reasonable explanations for an open door, and I told myself one of them was almost certainly what had happened here. I looked down the hall toward the living room. I looked up the stairs. Everything was still. I looked back at the open door. There was a light switch just inside it on the left. I could see the edge of the plate from where I was standing. I reached in without stepping through the doorway and found the switch and flipped it. The room was small and had no windows. The walls were bare. The floor was plain concrete, which was different from the rest of the house. In the center of the room, taking up most of the available space, was a chest freezer. Industrial-sized, the kind I'd seen in restaurant supply stores or commercial kitchens, white and rectangular with a long lid that ran the full length of it. It was humming faintly. I could feel the vibration of it through the concrete floor, even from the doorway. I stood there and looked at it. A chest freezer in a farmhouse wasn't strange on its own. People who live rurally often keep large freezers. They buy half a cow at a time, or they hunt, or they grow things and preserve them, and they need the storage. It was not an unusual thing to have. I knew that. I stepped into the room. The lid had a simple latch on the front, the kind that seals when you close it and releases when you push down on the lever. I put my hand on the latch and stood there for a moment with my hand on it, not opening it, just standing. Then I opened it. The cold came out first, a solid wave of it that hit my face and hands and the front of my shirt. Then the smell, faint but present, the dull mineral smell of frozen meat layered under the cleaner smell of frost and cold air. Inside the freezer were packages, dozens of them, stacked in neat, even rows. Each one was wrapped in white butcher paper, the kind with a slightly waxy coating on the outside and a plain white surface on top, and each one was labeled in black marker. I reached in and picked up the nearest package. The writing was neat, the letters evenly spaced, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who was taught penmanship and has spent a lifetime writing carefully. It said, Monsieur Patterson, March 14th, chuck roast, 4.2 pounds. I held the package and read it. Then I put it down and picked up the one next to it. J. Baker, July 22nd, tenderloin, 3.8 pounds. I set it back. I stood completely still for several seconds. My brain was doing something I've since come to think of as a kind of protective delay, a pause between receiving information and understanding its full meaning, like the way pain from a bad injury sometimes takes a few seconds to arrive after the moment of impact. I was looking at the packages. I was reading the labels. The information was in my head. I picked up a third one. S. Lisa, October 3rd, shoulder, 6.1 pounds. A full name, a date, a cut of meat, a weight, on every single package in the freezer. I put the package down. My hands weren't quite steady when I did it, and I misjudged the edge of the stack, and it slid off and hit the concrete floor with a dense, flat sound, the sound of something with real weight hitting a hard surface. "Find something interesting." I turned around. Henry was standing in the doorway. He was still wearing the red flannel shirt with the small round snap buttons. His expression was composed, unhurried, the same patient expression he'd worn at the dinner table, the same one he'd had when he opened the porch door and found me standing in the dark. He was looking at me the way someone looks when they've caught a child doing something predictable. I asked him about the names. He said they were guests, like me. I said what I was thinking, the only thing that made sense given everything in front of me, even though I couldn't fully make myself believe it yet. I said it plainly because there wasn't another way to say it. He shook his head slowly and said he wasn't killing anyone. He said he was feeding people. He said there was a difference. He stepped into the room and explained it with the same calm, measured tone he'd used to talk about his wife and his daughter at the dinner table. The same voice people use for things that seem perfectly ordinary to them. He said I had been hungry and he had fed me. He said that when I was gone, I would feed someone else. I heard every word. I understood every word. And then I ran. I got past him, through the doorway, and into the hall. The front door was at the end of the main hallway past the living room, and I ran for it in the dark, hitting my shoulder on the wall as I came around the corner and not stopping, reaching the door and grabbing the handle and pulling. It didn't move. I tried again, both hands, pulling hard. It was locked from the inside with a deadbolt and a separate chain lock, and both of them were set. I tried the deadbolt, which turned, and then the chain, which didn't. The end of it seated in the slide in a way that was simple enough, but that my hands weren't cooperating with properly. I could hear Henry behind me, unhurried, coming through the living room. I left the door and went upstairs. The stairs were dark, and I went up them fast, one hand on the banister, taking them two at a time. Henry followed at the base of the stairs, each step deliberate, not running. He wasn't rushing. That was the thing that was difficult to process in real time, the thing that my body understood before my mind did. He wasn't chasing me. He was simply following. At the top of the stairs, there was a short landing with 3 doors. I tried the nearest one. It opened. I went inside and pushed the door shut and turned the small lock in the handle, then looked around for something heavier and found a dresser against the wall beside the closet. It was solid wood and took everything I had, but I got it moving, dragging it across the floor and pushed it up against the door. My chest was heaving. I stood behind the dresser with my back against it and looked around the room. It was a plain bedroom, a single bed, a closet with the door partly open, a nightstand with nothing on it, a lamp in the corner, and a window on the far wall, the curtain drawn back, looking out over the side yard. I could hear Henry on the landing. He said my name through the door, not loudly. He wasn't raising his voice. He said I was making it harder than it needed to be. I crossed to the window and looked down. It was a straight drop, 20 feet at least, onto what looked in the dark like bare concrete, the kind of wide flat apron that runs alongside old farm buildings. Nothing to land on, no ledge, no trellis or pipe to climb down. 20 feet of open air onto hard concrete in the dark. Henry said something else through the door. His voice was muffled by the wood in the dresser. Something about being part of a cycle. Something about fighting it seeming ungrateful. I stopped listening and started looking for something I could use. The lamp in the corner was ceramic, heavy enough to matter. I unplugged it and pulled the cord out of the base and held it by the neck with both hands. Then the door handle stopped moving. I waited. His footsteps crossed the landing slowly and went back toward the stairs and then down them, one step at a time, until I couldn't hear them anymore. The house went quiet. I stood behind the dresser for a long time without moving. My arms were starting to ache from holding the lamp. I set it down slowly and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the door and tried to slow my breathing and think. There was nowhere to go. The window was 20 feet up. The door was the only other way out, and he was somewhere below it. I had my phone, which still had no signal, and the lamp, and that was everything. I sat in that bedroom for what I think was close to 2 hours. The darkness outside the window slowly changed, the deep black of the middle of the night giving way to the flat, featureless gray that comes just before dawn, and with it came the sounds of early morning. Birds somewhere distant, the faint shift in the quality of the air that you feel more than hear. No footsteps on the stairs, no sounds from below, nothing. When the light outside was gray enough that I could see clearly, I stood up and moved the dresser. I opened the door. The landing was empty, and the house was quiet, and I stood in the doorway for a long moment before I moved. I had the lamp in my right hand. I'd picked it back up before moving the dresser, without thinking about it. The way you hold on to the only thing you have, even when you know it probably isn't enough. I stood there and listened and heard nothing from below, nothing from the other rooms on the landing, nothing from outside. Just the birds I'd been hearing through the window, distant and ordinary, and the slow gray light coming up through the window at the end of the hall. I went down the stairs. I went slowly, keeping my weight on the outer edge of each step, where old staircases tend to creak less, one hand on the banister and the lamp held against my side. The living room came into view as I descended, gray and still. The blanket I'd used still folded on the couch where I'd left it. The front hallway. The door. Henry was sitting at the kitchen table. I could see him from the bottom of the stairs, through the open doorway that connected the hallway to the kitchen. He was sitting in the same chair he'd sat in at dinner, facing slightly away from me, and he had a mug in front of him and a newspaper open on the table, and the posture of someone who had slept well and gotten up at a reasonable hour and was doing what he did every morning. He turned his head when I reached the bottom of the stairs. He said good morning. He said the coffee was fresh if I wanted some. His voice was exactly what it had been the night before, warm and unhurried, and he was looking at me with the same patient expression he'd worn when he first opened the porch door and found me standing in the dark. I looked at him and then at the front door. He said the door was open. He said I could leave, walk back to my car, try to get help. He said it plainly, without any shift in tone, the way you tell someone where the extra towels are. I looked at the front door for a second longer and then back at him and asked if he was just letting me go. He said, of course. He said he wasn't going to force me to stay. He said he wasn't a monster. And then he picked up his coffee and took a slow sip and turned back to his newspaper like the conversation was finished. I didn't move for a moment. Every part of me was telling me not to turn my back on him, not to walk toward the door in a way that put him behind me. But the door was right there, and he wasn't moving, and standing at the bottom of the stairs wasn't getting me anywhere. I walked to the front door. The chain was unhooked. The deadbolt was unlocked. The handle turned, and the door swung open, and the morning air came in, cool and clean, and carrying the smell of dry grass and open distance. I stepped out onto the porch without looking back. I went down the porch steps and across the yard and hit the edge of the field and kept walking. I didn't look back at the house. I kept my eyes forward in the direction I'd come from the night before, using the angle of the early light to orient myself roughly east, back toward the highway. The field was easier to walk in daylight. I could see the ground clearly, the flat, pale grass, the dry soil between clumps of it, my own footprints from the night before still faint in the dust. I followed them. The highway appeared after about 20 minutes, a long flat line of gray asphalt running left to right across the landscape in front of me. I climbed up the slight incline of the shoulder and stepped onto the road and stopped. My car wasn't there. I looked in both directions. The road stretched out straight and flat in either direction, completely empty, and where my car had been, there was nothing. Not even tire marks on the gravel, just the empty shoulder, the white line at its edge, the road itself. I walked back and forth along the shoulder for about 50 yards in each direction, looking at the ground, looking at the road, and there was simply nothing there. I stood on the shoulder and thought about it for a few minutes. I told myself someone had towed it. That was the most reasonable explanation. A highway patrol car had come by sometime in the night and called for a tow, which was standard procedure for an abandoned vehicle. The car was in a lot somewhere nearby, and I just needed to find a phone and sort it out. It was an inconvenient thing, but not a catastrophic one. I picked a direction and started walking. I went west, which was the direction I'd been driving before the transmission gave out, which meant I'd been heading toward Missoula, which was the nearest city of any size. I didn't know how far it was. I hadn't been paying attention to distance markers before the car died, and I hadn't thought to check my last location on my phone before the signal dropped. But Missoula was west, and walking was what I had, and so I walked. The morning was clear and still. The sky was a flat, pale blue with a thin layer of high cloud that softened the sun without blocking it, and the temperature was mild enough to walk in comfortably, which was something. I had my jacket. I had my phone, which was at about 40% battery and still showing no signal. I had nothing to eat and no water and no idea how far I was from anything. I walked for what I estimated was about 2 hours before I stopped to rest. The road had not changed. It was the same flat, straight highway it had been for the entire walk, running through the same flat, open landscape, with no buildings visible in any direction, and no mile markers that I'd been able to find, and no other cars. Not a single car in 2 hours of walking along a highway. I had expected at minimum a handful of trucks, maybe a commuter or two heading toward wherever people in this part of Montana headed on a weekday morning. The road was empty. I rested for maybe 10 minutes sitting on the shoulder, and then I got up and kept going. The sun climbed and the temperature came up with it. Not hot, but warm enough that I took off my jacket and tied it around my waist after another hour. And after that, warm enough that the absence of water started to become something I was actively aware of, rather than just a background fact. My mouth was dry. I could feel the beginnings of a dull pressure behind my eyes that I associated with dehydration. I had not eaten anything since Henry's dinner the night before, and my stomach had gone past the point of growling and was just quietly absent, a hollow space that I kept not thinking about. I kept walking. The road curved gradually to the south at some point in the late morning. I noticed it as a slight bearing change, the sun shifting from directly ahead of me to slightly off my left shoulder, and I adjusted my path to stay on the road and kept going. The curve was long and gentle, the kind you barely register when you're driving, but that on foot takes a long time to move through. I watched the landscape on either side of the road change almost imperceptibly as I went. The same flat fields, the same low pale grass, the same enormous sky. My legs started to go around the time I figured it was close to noon. It wasn't a sudden thing. It was gradual, a heaviness in my thighs and calves that had been building for the last hour, and that kept increasing no matter how much I tried to control my pace or my stride. I slowed down. I kept going. And then my right knee went soft under me without any warning, and I stumbled and nearly went down, catching myself with one hand on the asphalt and standing back up slowly. I stood in the middle of the road and looked ahead, and there, off the road in the distance, set back from the highway across a flat, open field the same way it had been the night before, was a house. I stood and looked at it. I told myself it wasn't the same house. Montana was full of old farmhouses, white paint, 2 stories, a covered porch. Those were not distinguishing features in ranch country. It was a different house. It had to be. I had been walking west for the better part of 4 or 5 hours, and I hadn't turned around once, and that meant I was miles from where I'd started. But I stood there, and I looked at it, and something in me was already certain before I started moving. I turned around and walked the other direction. I don't know how to explain what the next several hours were like in a way that sounds accurate without sounding like I'm exaggerating. I walked east, back the way I'd come, for what felt like roughly the same amount of time I'd spent going west, maybe slightly longer, and the road did not change. It was the same road, the same flat asphalt, the same fields, the same sky. I passed no mile markers, no other roads branching off, no driveways, no buildings, no signs of any kind, just road in both directions going to the same flat horizon. The sun was lower when I finally stopped, past the midpoint of the sky and moving toward the west, which meant it was sometime in the afternoon, which meant I had been on this road for most of the day. My legs gave out the second time without much warning. I went down onto my knees on the asphalt and sat back on my heels and put my face in my hands and stayed there. I tried to think. The car being gone could be explained. The road curving back on itself could be explained. I'd made a wrong turn somewhere, or the road itself doubled back in a way that wasn't obvious from the ground. All of it could be explained if I was calm and systematic about it. I needed water. I needed to keep moving. I needed to get to something, a gas station, another house, any structure with another person in it. I lifted my head and looked up. Henry's farmhouse was in the distance, the same white paint, The same covered porch, the same single light above the porch door, which was on now even though it was still afternoon, a pale yellow point in the middle distance that I recognized the same way you recognize something from a recurring dream, with a specific, quiet dread that doesn't surprise you, even though part of you hoped it wouldn't be there. Henry was on the porch. He was sitting in one of the rocking chairs, the way the chairs had just been sitting there empty and still the night before. And he was watching me, not moving, not waving, just sitting and watching, with the patience of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how it goes. He said roads were funny out here. He said it was easy to get turned around. His voice carried across the flat, open distance between us in the still afternoon air with a clarity that had no right to exist at that range. And I heard every word as plainly as if he were standing next to me. My legs went out from under me on his front lawn. I didn't feel the ground when I hit it. I remember the grass against my cheek, short and dry and smelling faintly of dust. And then I remember nothing. When I came back, it was from somewhere far below consciousness, a long, slow rise toward light and sound, and the dull, full-body ache of someone who has walked for 10 hours with no water and no food, and then hit the ground hard. I opened my eyes. I was on the couch. The blanket was over me. The same blanket from the night before, folded the same way. The living room was dim, the afternoon light coming through the curtains at a low angle that told me it was late in the day. The clock was ticking in the other room. Henry was in the armchair across from me. He was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, watching me with that same patient expression, and on the coffee table between us, there was a glass of water. I looked at the water, and then at him, and then at the water again. My mouth was so dry I could feel it in my teeth. I drank the water. I didn't decide to. My body just did it, picked up the glass, and drained it before whatever was left of my better judgment could say anything about it. Henry watched me drink. Then he said it plainly and without any particular drama. He said there was nowhere to go. He said the farm was special, that once you were here, really here, you couldn't leave. Not alive. I asked how long. I meant how long had he been doing this? He thought about it the way you think about something when you genuinely aren't sure of the answer. He said it was hard to say. That time moved differently here. He said 20 years, maybe 30, maybe more, and that after a while you stopped counting. I asked why me. He said why anyone, in the same even tone, as if this were a philosophical question rather than an answer. I felt the room start to move. Not dramatically, just a slow, subtle shift in my peripheral vision, a softening of the edges of things. I tried to focus on the wall behind Henry, on a fixed point. My hands felt heavy. He stood up. He said to get some rest. He said the ones who fight back always taste bitter. And he said it the way you'd say any small observation about food, a preference, a note of experience. The room went dark without any transition that I noticed. I woke up on a cot, not the couch. A cot, the kind with a thin aluminum frame and a canvas surface that sags slightly in the middle under any real weight. I was on my back, staring up at a ceiling made of bare wooden joists with the subfloor of the room above visible between them, and the light was coming from a single bulb screwed into a fixture mounted on one of the joists directly above me, and the air was cool and smelled like soil and concrete and the faint particular dampness of a space that has been underground for a long time. I lay still for a moment and took stock. I was in the basement. I was still in my clothes from 2 days ago, the same jeans and shirt and socks, though my boots were sitting on the floor next to the cot, placed neatly side by side the way you put them when you take them off before bed. Someone had taken them off while I was unconscious and set them there, and I looked at that for a moment without moving. The basement was a single large room with concrete walls and a concrete floor and the wooden ceiling above me. It was roughly the size of the kitchen and living room combined, which made sense given the footprint of the house. Along one wall, there were shelves holding glass jars, the kind used for preserving, filled with things I didn't look at closely. There was a utility sink in the far corner with a single tap. There was a wooden chair against the wall near the base of the stairs. And there were the stairs themselves, a straight wooden staircase rising to a door at the top. The door closed, a thin line of light visible at the bottom of it. I sat up slowly. My body felt like something that had been wrung out and put back together without all the pieces in the right places. My legs ached deeply from the walking, and my head had the dense, pressure-filled quality of someone who has been unconscious for longer than sleep. I sat on the edge of the cot for a while, with my hands on my knees, not thinking about anything specific, just letting my eyes adjust fully and my head clear enough to be useful. Then I heard the footsteps above me, one set, slow and even, moving from what I estimated was the back of the house toward the front, the kitchen to the living room. They stopped for a while and then came back. The same patient, unhurried pace that I had heard on the stairs the night before last. The same footfall that I had spent hours listening for from behind a dresser-blocked door. A few minutes later, the door at the top of the stairs opened. Henry came down carrying a tray. On the tray were a bowl of something hot, a piece of bread, and a glass of water. He came down the stairs without hurrying and set the tray on the wooden chair and looked at me with the same expression he always had. He said good morning, though I had no way of knowing if it was morning. I asked where my phone was. He said it was on the tray, under the bowl. I looked, and it was there, screen down, and I picked it up and turned it over. Still no signal. Battery at 11%. I put it face down on the cot beside me. He said I should eat something. He said I'd been out for a long time. I didn't say anything. He stood there for a moment longer, looking at me with that patient, assessing expression. And then he went back up the stairs and closed the door, and I heard the latch engage. I sat there with the tray on the chair in front of me and the food steaming quietly, and I did not touch it for a long time. The thing was, I was hungry. I was deeply, hollowly hungry in a way that went past discomfort into something more physical and insistent, the kind of hunger that stops being a feeling and starts being a condition. I hadn't eaten since the dinner 2 nights ago, not counting whatever had been in the water he'd given me on the couch, and my body was making its position clear on the subject in a way that was hard to ignore. I thought about what he'd said in the freezer room, about feeding people, about the cycle. Then I thought about the fact that everything on the tray was vegetables, roasted carrots and parsnips in a bowl with herbs, a thick piece of bread that smelled like it had come out of the oven that morning. No meat. I ate the bread. I told myself it was just bread. Then I ate the vegetables because I needed to, and because lying on a cot in a basement too weak to move wasn't going to help me find a way out of any of this. The water I drank slowly, watching it the same way you watch something you're not entirely sure about, which I understood was irrational, because if he wanted to drug me, he'd already done it twice, and a third time wasn't going to be prevented by me staring at the glass. I drank it anyway. After that, I felt well enough to stand up and move around. I did a thorough inspection of the basement that I already half knew the result of before I started. The walls were solid poured concrete with no windows and no gaps. The utility sink had a drain, but the pipe under it was narrow and went straight into the concrete floor. The shelves were fixed to the wall and made of thick wood and weren't going anywhere. The stairs were solid. The door at the top of them was, when I went up and tried the handle quietly, locked from the outside with what felt like a simple bolt rather than a keyed lock, which meant there was nothing to pick even if I had something to pick it with. I stood at the top of the stairs with my hand on the door handle for a while and listened. Silence from above, the house making its small sounds, nothing that told me anything useful. I went back down and sat on the cot. Henry came down 3 more times over the course of what I estimated was the rest of that day and into the evening, always with a tray, always the same kind of food, vegetables and bread and water. He didn't speak much. Once he asked if I needed anything and I said a phone that worked, and he looked at me for a moment and then picked up the empty tray and went back upstairs. Another time he came down just to check that the bulb hadn't burned out, or that's what it looked like from where I was sitting, standing under the light and looking up at it for a moment before going back up. He didn't seem angry. He didn't seem anything really. He just moved through the basement the way he moved through everything else, as if it were all perfectly ordinary and there was no particular urgency to any of it. I had my phone. No signal, but I had it, and I started writing things down in the Notes app. Everything from the moment the car had died on the highway, the walk to the farmhouse, Henry, the dinner, the freezer room and the packages with the names on them, the road that had brought me back, all of it, as specifically and clearly as I could, because writing it down was the only thing that made any of it feel real and containable, and because some part of me wanted it to exist outside of my own head in case I stopped being the only record of it. The battery dropped as I wrote. 17%, 14, 11. I stopped writing and let the phone rest. The basement had no way of telling time, and my phone's clock said it was Thursday, but I wasn't entirely sure I trusted it. I slept on the cot in intervals, waking and lying still, and listening, and then sleeping again. The light from the single bulb above me never changed. Henry came and went. Time moved in the loose, unmeasured way it does in spaces with no windows and no natural rhythm to mark the hours. At some point that I estimated was late morning, I was sitting on the cot with my back against the wall when I heard something different from above. It wasn't Henry's footsteps. It was the sound of the front door, which I'd heard enough times to know. The particular way the hinges and the warped frame made the door stick slightly before it opened all the way. And then voices. I sat forward. 2 voices. One of them Henry's, though I couldn't make out the words clearly through the floor above me. The other was a woman's voice, and she was talking the way people talk when they're tired and slightly anxious, the overlapping sentences and compressed explanations of someone relaying a problem. A car. Their car had broken down. No signal. Was there a phone? I stood up from the cot. Henry's voice again, warm and welcoming. Come in, come in. The sound of the front door opening wider, 2 sets of footsteps entering the house, and then a third set, lighter and faster, the way a child walks when they're trying to keep up with adults. Henry asked something about the child. His voice carried the same gentle, interested warmth it had carried when he asked me when I'd last eaten. The woman answered, said something I couldn't fully hear. Then the child's voice, small and clear, cut through the floor above me with the particular carrying quality that children's voices have. The child said it was hungry. I was already at the base of the stairs. I went up them as fast as I could without making noise, which wasn't very fast. The wood was old, and it creaked on the 3rd step and the 7th, and I couldn't avoid it. At the top, I put both hands flat on the door and pushed. It held. I could hear them moving above me, the sound of chairs being pulled back, the clink of dishes, Henry's voice in the low, steady register he used when he was being hospitable. I knocked on the door, hard, with the flat of my fist. Nothing changed above me. I knocked again, harder, and called out, and my voice came back to me in the enclosed stairwell, sounding strange and muffled, the way voices sound in sealed spaces, and I couldn't tell from inside whether it was carrying through the door and into the house, or just bouncing off the wood and coming back. I went back down. I looked up at the floor above me. Old wooden joists, old subfloor boards. I could see hairline gaps between some of them, where the wood had contracted over decades of dry winters. I could hear through those gaps. Sound traveled both ways. I started hitting the ceiling with my palm, flat-handed, as hard as I could reach. The sound came back into the basement as a dull, compressed thud, and I had no way of knowing what it sounded like from above, whether it sounded like anything at all, or like a pipe settling, or the house shifting in the afternoon heat. I kept going until my palms were sore, and then I kept going after that, switching hands, and at some point, I was hitting it with the side of my fist and the joints of my knuckles, and the skin split on 2 of my knuckles without me noticing until I looked at my hand and saw the blood. I stopped. Above me, the sounds of the kitchen, spoons against bowls, a chair moving slightly on the floor, Henry's voice, just the low, warm murmur of it, saying something I couldn't make out. The woman responding, shorter now, quieter. The child saying something. Then silence. Not the silence of people eating. The immediate, total silence of a room that has gone from occupied to empty in a single moment. The kind of silence that has a different quality from ordinary quiet, that feels like a held breath rather than an absence of sound. A single chair scraped once across the floor. One set of footsteps moved through the kitchen, slow and unhurried, the familiar pace. They stopped somewhere near the center of the room and didn't move for a long time. I stood at the base of the stairs with my bleeding hand at my side and my forehead resting against the door above me, and listened. Henry's voice came through the floor so quietly that I almost missed it entirely, a sound at the low edge of what was audible, the single syllable of it disappearing almost before it arrived. He said, The footsteps moved to what I estimated was the edge of the kitchen, toward the back of the house. They paused. Then they started toward the basement door. My phone screen went black in my pocket. I heard his footsteps stop at the basement door. There was a pause, long enough that I counted my own breaths without meaning to, standing at the bottom of the stairs with my back pressed against the wall and my bleeding hand held against my shirt. 4 breaths. 5. The door at the top of the stairs was a thin rectangle of faint light from the hallway beyond it, and I watched it and didn't move and waited for the latch to lift. It didn't. The footsteps moved away from the door, back through the kitchen, toward the rear of the house. A door opened and closed somewhere above me, not the basement door, something else. And then the house went quiet in the particular way it went quiet at night. That total, pressurized silence that had no bottom to it. I stood at the base of the stairs for a long time after that. I didn't go back to the cot. I sat down on the bottom step with my back against the wall and my knees pulled up, and I looked at the basement, and I thought, as clearly and deliberately as I could, about what I knew and what I didn't know, and what, if anything, I could do with the difference. What I knew was this. The basement had one exit that I'd found, the door at the top of the stairs, which was bolted from the outside. The walls were solid. The floor was concrete. Henry came down at regular intervals, 3 times the day before, and presumably on a similar schedule going forward. And when he came down, he unlocked the bolt and opened the door and carried a tray and was standing at the top of the stairs before he was fully in the room, which meant that the stairs were not a viable place to try anything because he would see me coming, and he was between me and the door the entire time. What I didn't know was harder. I didn't know what had happened to the woman and the child. I didn't know how the road worked, whether what had happened to me would happen to anyone who tried to leave, or whether it was specific to me, whether there was some boundary or perimeter beyond which things went back to normal, or whether the road just went on forever in both directions and always brought you back to the same farmhouse, no matter how far or how long you walked. I didn't know how many people were in the freezer. I hadn't counted the packages. I'd picked up 3 and read them and dropped the 3rd one, and then Henry had been in the doorway, and I'd run. I didn't know how many there were in total, whether the freezer held dozens or hundreds, whether the dates on the labels went back 20 years the way Henry had suggested, or further than that. I sat on the bottom step and turned my phone over in my hands. The screen was black. I pressed the power button and held it, and nothing happened. Dead. Not just the screen, but the battery, fully drained. I held it for a while anyway, the way you hold something familiar when there's nothing else to do with your hands. The shape of it unchanged, just a rectangle of glass and aluminum that had become in the last several days the only object I had that connected me to anything outside of this house. I set it down on the step beside me. The basement light above me hummed faintly. I hadn't noticed the sound before, but now in the quiet, I could hear it. A very low electrical hum that came and went slightly, as if the current feeding it was uneven. The light itself was steady. I looked up at the bulb and thought about what would happen if it burned out, and I was down here in the dark. And then I stopped thinking about that. At some point, I must have slept, because I came back to myself, sitting upright on the step, with my chin on my chest, and the basement unchanged around me. The same light, the same silence, no way of knowing how much time had passed. My neck ached. My hand had dried where the knuckles had split, and the skin was tight and dark across the joints. I got up and went to the utility sink and ran cold water over my hand for a while. The water pressure was low but steady, a thin stream of cold well water that carried the faint mineral smell that all well water has. I washed my hand and dried it on my shirt and looked around the basement again. I had been over every inch of it. I knew that, but I went over it again because there was nothing else to do, and because the alternative was sitting on the cot, thinking about the woman and the child and the silence that had fallen over the kitchen above me, and I wasn't ready to sit with that yet. The shelves along the wall held glass preserving jars, 24 of them at least, arranged in rows. I had not looked at them closely before. I looked at them now. Most of them held things that looked like ordinary preserves, dark fruits in syrup, something that might have been pickled vegetables, a pale amber liquid that could have been anything. The jars were sealed with metal lids and rings. The labels on them were the same black marker on white paper as the packages in the freezer upstairs. I read several of them, and then I stopped reading them. I moved away from the shelves and sat on the cot. The stairs creaked. I sat up straight. The sound came from above the door, not from the basement stairs themselves, just the house settling the way old houses do, the wood contracting in the cool of what I assumed was night. I waited. Nothing followed it. I lay back on the cot and stared at the joists above me and tried to think about Gerald, my cat. He was a gray tabby with one slightly bent ear and an extremely strong opinion about what time his dinner should happen. And he was currently at my apartment in St. Paul, probably having been fed by my neighbor Karen, who had a spare key, because Karen was the kind of person who checked in on things without being asked. I thought about Gerald sitting on the windowsill of my apartment, the one that faced the street, where he liked to watch the cars. I thought about that in as much detail as I could manage. The specific texture of the carpet under the window, the way the afternoon light came through at a low angle in the fall and made a long, warm rectangle on the floor that Gerald treated as a personal possession. I kept thinking about it until it stopped working and the basement came back. The latch at the top of the stairs lifted. I sat up. The door opened slowly, and Henry came down carrying the tray, the same bowl, the same glass of water. He came down without hurrying and looked at me on the cot and set the tray on the chair and straightened up. I asked about the woman and the child. He looked at me for a moment. His expression didn't change, didn't close down or shift into something defensive. He just looked at me the way he always looked at me, with that patient, almost gentle attention, as if my question were a reasonable one that he was considering honestly. He said they'd had a long drive. He said they needed rest. I asked where they were. He said they were comfortable. He said it the same way he'd said the couch was comfortable on my first night, with the same mild proprietorial warmth. I asked if he was going to do to them what he was going to do to me. He picked up the empty tray from the previous meal and held it against his side and looked at me with something that, in any other context, I would have described as genuine sadness. He said everyone who came here was already on their way somewhere. He said that somewhere had just changed. He said it as if this were a comfort rather than what it was. I asked him about the road. I asked him how it worked, why it kept bringing people back to the farm. whether there was a point at which someone could leave and actually get clear of the place. He considered this for a moment in a way that felt real, not performative. The way someone considers a question they find genuinely interesting. He said the land had been like this as long as he could remember. He said his father had told him the same thing his father had told him, that the farm sat in a particular relationship to the surrounding landscape that didn't translate to maps or distances, that once you had been inside the house and eaten at the table, the land recognized you and kept you close the way a dog keeps track of familiar smells. I asked what would happen if I refused to eat. He said it wouldn't change anything. He said the land didn't care what you ate. He said the eating was for me, not for him. Then he went back up the stairs and the latch dropped back into place. I sat with the tray and didn't touch it for a while. Then I ate, because the same logic applied as before, because I needed to be able to think and move, and I couldn't do either if I was lying on the cot too weak to sit up, and because whatever was going to happen or not happen probably wasn't going to be decided by whether I ate a bowl of roasted vegetables in a basement. I put the empty bowl back on the tray and lay down. I thought about the door at the top of the stairs. I thought about it in a specific engineering way, the way you think about a problem when you decide to stop being afraid of it and start trying to understand it. The bolt was on the outside. Old farmhouses used simple barrel bolts on basement doors, a horizontal metal bar that slid into a receiver mounted on the door frame. From the inside, there was nothing to work with. The door opened inward, toward the basement, which meant there was nothing to push against. The wood of the door itself was old, but solid. The hinges were on the outside. I kept thinking about the hinges. When Henry came down the next time I was sitting on the cot in exactly the position I had been sitting in every other time he came down, which was what I wanted him to see, and I watched him come down and set the tray and pick up the old one and go back up, and I watched the door at the top of the stairs with a specific and focused attention the entire time it was open. The hinges were old, pin hinges, the kind with a removable pin running vertically through the knuckle. The pins were exposed on the basement side when the door was open, which the door always was when Henry was coming down or going up. I could see the heads of the pins from the bottom of the stairs, the domed tops of them, unthreaded, held in place by gravity and decades of paint and friction. The pins could be driven out from below. I needed something long and thin and hard. I went through the basement again with that specific purpose and found it on the third pass, behind the shelves on the wall, a long metal rod, roughly the diameter of a pencil, that I thought might once have been part of a shelf bracket. It had enough weight to it to work as a driver if I had something to strike it with. I needed something to strike it with. There was the cot. The aluminum frame of the cot had a cross member at each end, the bar that the canvas lashed to, and the bars were connected to the legs by a simple pin joint of their own. It took me a long time to work one of the cross members free, much longer than it should have. My hands weren't cooperating well, and I had to stop twice when I heard sounds above me and sit back on the cot and wait until they passed. But it came free eventually. A solid bar of aluminum about 18 inches long, dense enough to use as a mallet. I sat with both pieces on the cot and thought about the door. Henry came down the next time, and I was sitting there with my hands in my lap, and the rod and the aluminum bar were under the cot, pushed against the wall, invisible from the stairs. He came down and set the tray and looked at me and asked if I was sleeping all right. I said I was. He nodded and picked up the old tray and went back up. I waited until I heard him moving in the kitchen above me, and I went to the base of the stairs. I went up slowly, testing each step for creak before committing my full weight to it. The third step and the seventh were the ones that talked. I already knew that. I stepped over the third and went wide to the right on the seventh, my foot near the outer edge of the tread where it met the stringer, where old stairs tend to be quieter, and it held. At the top, I positioned the rod against the bottom of the lower hinge pin and felt the head of it with my fingertip to confirm the angle. The door was closed. The gap between the door and the frame was narrow, but I could get the rod into it. I had the aluminum bar in my right hand. Above me, footsteps moving through the kitchen toward the front of the house. I held still. They stopped in what sounded like the living room and stayed there. A long pause. Then a sound I hadn't heard before. The television, crackling on the way old televisions do when they've been cold and take a moment to come up to temperature. The sound of it came down through the floor above me, faint and tinny, the unmistakable audio texture of someone watching the news. I set the rod against the hinge pin and struck it with the bar. The sound it made was sharper than I wanted, a high metallic crack, and I pulled both hands back and pressed flat against the wall at the top of the stairs and waited. The television continued. The footsteps didn't change. I waited 60 seconds. Then I went back to the hinge and struck it again, harder this time, and felt the pin shift. A third strike. The pin rose a quarter inch out of the knuckle, the dome of its head now standing clear of the barrel. I got my fingernails under it and worked it out the rest of the way. The lower hinge came free with a soft sound of metal separating. The upper hinge pin took longer. The angle was harder to work from the stairs, and I had to stretch to reach it, and the rod kept slipping. But after several minutes, I felt it give and then shift and then rise, and I worked it out with my fingernails the same way and held both pins in my palm. I took a breath. I put my fingers into the gap on the latch side of the door and pulled. The door swung toward me, pivoting on the bolt rather than the hinges, turning outward in a slow arc that it had never been designed to make. The bolt held, but the door itself, freed of its hinges, bent at the frame, and the gap widened, and I pulled harder, and the frame gave along the old dry wood where the bolt receiver was mounted, and the door came open. The hallway was empty. I stood in it for a moment with the door hanging at an angle behind me and listened. The television from the living room. The news. Some voice talking about something far away from here. No footsteps. No sounds from the kitchen. I went toward the front door. I didn't run. I moved quickly and quietly, and I did not look into the living room as I passed it, because I didn't want to see what was in it, and because the front door was 6 steps away, and whatever was in the living room was going to have to wait. The front door was unlocked. I turned the handle and opened it and stepped out onto the porch, and the cold outside air hit me full in the face, and I kept moving, down the steps and across the yard, not toward the road this time. Not toward the road. I went toward the barn. The barn was 50 yards behind the house, dark and quiet. The large sliding door on the front of it closed, but not padlocked. I pulled it open just enough to get through and stepped inside. It smelled like old hay and motor oil and cold metal. There were tools along the walls, hand tools and larger implements on hooks, and in the center of the barn floor, covered by a canvas tarp, was a shape that I recognized even under the tarp. A truck. Not the old truck parked outside. A different one, smaller, pulled inside and covered. I pulled the tarp off and looked at it. The keys were in it. Not just in it, but in the ignition, which told me something about how long it had been since anyone had thought about this truck as a way of leaving. I got in and looked at the dash for a long moment before I turned the key. I thought about the road. I thought about what Henry had said, about the land recognizing you, about the farm sitting in a particular relationship to the surrounding distance that didn't translate to maps. I thought about the woman and the child somewhere in the house behind me. I turned the key. The engine started. I sat with it running for a moment, listening to it, and then I put it in gear and pushed the barn door open with the front bumper and drove out into the yard. And I turned away from the house and headed toward the field, not toward the road. Away from the road entirely. I drove across the open, flat ground with the headlights cutting a pale corridor through the dark, and I did not look in the mirror for a long time. And when I finally did, the house was behind me. Its single porch light a small yellow point in the dark, and it was getting smaller. I drove. The field went on for a long time, much longer than it should have given the size of the property. The ground was flat and firm under the tires, and I kept the headlights pointed away from the road and away from the house. And I just drove, and I held the wheel and watched the distance and tried not to think about what I was leaving behind me and what might already be past saving. The field ended at a fence line, a wire fence, old but intact, running perpendicular to my path. I stopped at it and got out and found a wooden post that was leaning and pulled the wire down on one side enough to drive over it. And I got back in and drove over the downed wire and kept going on the other side. The ground changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The short, pale grass gave way to something slightly different, lower, and the soil under the tires had a different texture. And after another 10 minutes of driving, I saw a light ahead. Not a porch light. A street light mounted on a pole, the flat white light of a highway intersection, and below it a road and a sign, and to the right of the sign, the dark shape of a building with a lit window, a gas station. The pumps standing in their small island of fluorescent light, like something from another world entirely. I drove to it. The lot was empty, except for a pickup truck at the far pump. I pulled in and stopped next to the door and sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running and my hands still on the wheel, and looked at the lit window of the station. Inside, I could see a man behind the counter, young, early 20s, looking at his phone. Ordinary. The most ordinary thing I had ever seen in my life. I got out of the truck and went inside. The door had a bell on it, and it rang when I pushed it open, and the young man looked up from his phone and said something. Probably asked if he could help me. And I stood there in the doorway and looked at him and the lit refrigerator cases along the wall and the rack of chips by the register and the small television mounted in the corner, showing the same news I'd heard through the basement ceiling. I asked if he had a phone I could use. He said sure, and reached under the counter and produced a cordless handset and slid it across to me, and I stood at the counter and called 911. And when the dispatcher picked up on the second ring, I told her my name and where I was, and that I needed the police, and that there was a farmhouse on Highway 212 where I had been held against my will and where I believed other people might be in danger. She said she was sending someone. She said to stay on the line. I stayed on the line. I stood at the counter in that gas station with the cold of the refrigerator cases at my back and the bell on the door and the young man looking at me with the cautious, uncertain attention of someone who isn't sure what they've walked into, and I stayed on the line. I kept thinking about the woman, what she had sounded like, the tired and slightly anxious voice of someone relaying a problem, the compressed sentences, the overlap of the child's voice underneath hers. I kept thinking about the child saying it was hungry. I kept thinking about the sound of the chair scraping once across the kitchen floor, the single set of footsteps, the silence. I don't know what they found when they got to the farm. I was taken to a hospital in Missoula that night, and I stayed there for 2 days while they checked me over, and a detective came and sat across a table from me, and I told him everything I've written here. He listened without interrupting. He wrote things down. When I was done, he looked at his notes for a moment and then looked at me and said they had found the farm, but that the house was empty. He said empty like he meant nothing there at all. No Henry, no other people, no tray, no cot, no single bulb on a joist. He said it was an abandoned property, that records showed it had been unoccupied for over a decade. He said the freezer I described did not match what they found in the house. I asked what they found in the house. He said a freezer, small, chest type, older model, empty, unplugged. I looked at him for a while. He asked if I had anyone he could call. I said my sister. He asked for her number, and I gave it to him, and he stepped out to make the call. And I sat in the room alone and looked at the table and thought about the packages with the names and the dates and the weights, and about the road that curves back on itself, and about Henry's voice carrying across the flat open distance of the field in the still afternoon air. I thought about the woman's voice, the child's. The detective came back in and said my sister was on her way. I nodded. I have been in my sister's house for 9 days now. I sleep with the light on. I eat when she puts food in front of me. Gerald is here. She went and got him from my apartment. He sits on the windowsill the way he always has, watching the street, indifferent to everything that has happened. The detective called once, 4 days ago. He said the truck I drove to the gas station was registered to a man named Carl Briggs, reported stolen from a property in Cascade County 6 years ago. He said they were looking into it. He said he would be in touch. He hasn't called since. I have thought about the woman and the child every day. I have thought about whether what I did was enough or whether I should have stayed, whether driving away in the truck was a decision I made for the right reasons or just the only decision I could find that had an exit at the end of it. I don't have an answer to that, and I'm not sure I will. What I know is that I got out. I know that the road exists, that it runs through a stretch of Montana on Highway 212, flat and empty and lit by nothing, and that there is a farmhouse set back from it in a field, white paint gone gray in patches, a covered porch, one light above the door. I know that if your car breaks down on that road at night, and you see that light, and you walk toward it across the dark open field, and a man answers the door in a red flannel shirt with small round snap buttons and tells you his name is Henry and that there's food on the stove and you're welcome to stay. I know what you should do. Don't go inside. Don't eat the food. And if you do, and if you somehow get out, don't take the road. Drive across the field until you find the fence. Pull down the wire. Keep going until the ground changes under you. Keep your eyes on the distance and don't look back, no matter what you see in the mirror. Just drive.